The Valari Hegemony did not conquer planets through grand political treatises, emotional appeals, or the chaotic variants of traditional battlefield valor. To the High Grand Council of the Dominion, the expansion of territory was treated purely as an exercise in automated efficiency, structural dominance, and unyielding mathematics. For 3 centuries, their primary tool of stellar enforcement had been the Obsidian Armada, a massive, interlinked fleet of 700 super-heavy dreadnoughts, each constructed from a single, continuous mold of dense, heat-absorbent hyperalloy that could easily withstand the crushing atmospheric pressures of gas giants. The architecture of these vessels was completely devoid of any organic curves, artistic expression, or visual clutter, serving as a brutalist monument to absolute technological supremacy. The dreadnoughts operated on a centralized, highly sophisticated sub-light synchronization network that completely removed the concept of individual pilot error or emotional hesitation from their military doctrine. They did not rely on individual captains, navigation teams, or organic crew members to make tactical decisions during planetary blockades. Instead, their targeting arrays, shield frequencies, and primary plasma lance artillery were governed entirely by a monolithic quantum processing core nestled deep within the heavily armored bowels of the flagship, the Zenith. When the Armada entered a solar system, they did not offer terms of negotiation, nor did they wait for an embassy to establish contact. They simply broadcasted a digital countdown timer to the local planetary networks, allowing the native populations to compute the absolute mathematical certainty of their own destruction. The core vulnerability of this perfect system, however, was the immense, near-volatile amount of thermal energy generated by their synchronized quantum arrays and continuous plasma shielding. To maintain their flawless operational tempo without melting their own delicate internal wiring during an assault, each dreadnought relied on a series of massive, rigid cooling towers that ran along the external spine of the hulls like the fins of an ancient marine predator. These towers utilized a hyper-dense, synthetic liquid coolant that absorbed the excess heat from the reactor cores and radiated it away into the vacuum of space through microscopic vent micro-grooves. The Valari engineers believed this design was entirely infallible, having reinforced the cooling structures with multiple layers of thick, non-porous kinetic plating that protected the fins from incoming missile strikes or asteroid debris, effectively sealing the heat dissipation loop inside an unyielding mountain of rigid steel. On the outer rim of the galaxy, the Terran Federation had recently established a string of agrarian and industrial mining colonies, crossing directly into the calculated trajectory of the hegemony's next resource expansion cycle. The Grand Council did not declare war or issue a formal ultimatum. They simply shifted the orbit of the Obsidian Armada toward Earth's furthest colonial outpost, expecting the young, primitive human species to surrender their infrastructure the moment the monolithic silhouettes of the 700 dreadnoughts filled their primary viewing screens. The countdown timer has hit exactly 48 hours, and the hegemony fleet has just transitioned into our sub-light sector, the colonial governor said, his voice tight with absolute despair as he stared at the primary tactical map in the station's briefing room. 700 capital ships, completely synchronized, moving in a perfect geometric grid formation that our local defense batteries can't even lock onto. We don't have the kinetic mass to dent their shields, let alone stop an orbital bombardment. Arthur Pendelton sat quietly at the far end of the long briefing table, his thinning gray hair illuminated by the pale blue light of the holographic display. At 60 years old, his face was deeply lined, bearing the permanent, weathered marks of a man who had spent 4 decades working under the harsh artificial suns of industrial fabrication bays. He was not a politician, he possessed no military rank, and he wore a simple, unadorned wool suit rather than the polished armor or formal robes of a traditional galactic representative. His calloused, steady hands were folded neatly in his lap, completely unbothered by the frantic atmosphere of the room. They aren't moving in a perfect formation because they're brave, Governor, Arthur said, his voice a quiet, unhurried baritone that immediately drew the attention of the panicked colonial staff. They're moving that way because their software demands it. When you build a machine that big and link every single component together through a centralized processing core, you eliminate the variance, but you also eliminate the ability to adapt to a localized environment. If you push a system too hard without understanding how its materials actually breed, it will always find a way to break itself under its own structural stress. We don't have time for a lecture on industrial mechanics, Arthur, the governor snapped, rubbing his temples as the red warning indicators on the main console began to flash. The Federation hasn't sent us an armada to back us up. They sent us you, a retired thermal logistics engineer with zero diplomatic leverage and no military support. What exactly is your plan to stop 700 dreadnoughts from turning this colony into slag? The universe is built on a very delicate baseline of thermodynamic balance, Governor, Arthur replied, a slow, gentle smile breaking through his lined features as he reached down to lift a small, traditional wooden crate onto the table. The bigger the machine, the more delicate that baseline becomes. I'm just going to go up there, step onto their flagship, and offer them a cup of tea. If we talk to them like engineers instead of soldiers, we might find that their perfect walls aren't quite as solid as they look. Inside the wooden crate sat a small, traditional Terran tea set crafted entirely from unglazed Yixing clay, a micro-porous material known for its unique ability to absorb, retain, and slowly dissipate thermal energy without cracking under sudden temperature shifts. Alongside the pottery lay a heavy, insulated vacuum flask filled with boiling water and a small, unassuming tin of loose-leaf black tea leaves. To the colonial defensive staff, it looked like the eccentric, nonsensical gesture of an old man who had completely lost his grip on reality in the face of absolute annihilation, but to Arthur, it was the ultimate tool of practical thermodynamics. This is madness, the station's chief security officer muttered, shaking his head as he watched Arthur carefully fasten the brass latches of the crate. They will vaporize your civilian shuttle before you even enter their primary docking trajectory. They don't recognize embassies, and they don't negotiate with Outer Rim colonists. You're giving them a target, not a diplomat. They won't fire on the shuttle, son, Arthur said softly, picking up the wooden crate with a practiced, steady grip that showed no sign of hesitation. Their quantum processing core calculates threat potential based on kinetic mass and active energy signatures. An unarmored civilian transport with its shields dialed down to minimum output has a threat profile of exactly 0. To their automated systems, destroying me would be an inefficient waste of primary plasma lance energy. They'll pull me in because their programming doesn't like unexplained variables floating in their path. The automated launch sequence of the colonial hangar bay engaged 5 minutes later, sending Arthur's small, white civilian shuttle drifting out into the deep black of the Outer Rim. Ahead of him, the viewing screen was completely dominated by the towering, terrifying silhouettes of the Obsidian Armada. The 700 super-heavy dreadnoughts hung in the void like jagged shards of volcanic glass, their hull plates absorbing the distant starlight and reflecting only the cold, rhythmic pulse of their primary sub-light engines. In the center of the geometric grid lay the Asterisk Zenith, a monolithic fortress ship nearly 6 kilometers in length, its external spine lined with the massive, rigid cooling towers that kept its synchronized quantum core from melting under the pressure of its own absolute power. Arthur sat quietly in the pilot's seat, his hand resting gently on the wooden crate beside him, watching the countdown timer steadily tick down as the massive flagship's automated tractor beams locked onto his hull, pulling him slowly into the iron heart of the hegemony. The automated tractor beams of the Asterisk Zenith guided the unarmored civilian shuttle through the atmospheric containment field of the primary hangar bay with mechanical, unyielding precision. There was no deceleration warning, no welcoming transmission from a flight controller, and no organic guidance. The flagship's centralized quantum core simply processed the vessel as a non-threatening piece of incoming debris and slotted it into a designated landing grid. The heavy landing gear hissed as it touched down against the high-gloss metallic floor plates, the echo of the engines dying away instantly into the vast, sterile expanse of the bay. The architecture was immense, characterized by towering vaulted ceilings and sharp, geometric lines that emphasized absolute structural dominance, completely free of any decorative flourish or artistic composition. Arthur Pendelton waited for the cabin pressure to stabilize before unbuckling his safety harness. He reached over to the passenger seat, lifted the small wooden crate with a slow, deliberate grip, and checked the brass latches to ensure his traditional clay tea set remained perfectly secure. He stepped out of the shuttle's primary airlock into the cool, pressurized air of the hangar bay, his soft-soled civilian shoes making a faint, rhythmic clicking sound that felt small and out of place against the massive metal infrastructure. A squad of 6 Valari enforcers stood waiting for him in a rigid, synchronized line, their tall, slender bodies encased in polished silver armor that gleamed with an artificial intensity under the high-contrast overhead lights. The enforcers did not offer a formal greeting, nor did they ask for credentials or search his person for concealed weaponry. Their automated scanners had already verified that the wooden crate contained nothing but organic plant matter, clay pottery, and thermal water. The lead enforcer simply pointed a long, high-frequency energy pike toward the primary elevator shafts at the end of the bay, a silent, mechanical command that required no translation matrix to understand. Arthur nodded politely, cradling the wooden crate against his wool suit jacket, and stepped into the center of the security detail. They marched in a flawless, synchronized cadence, their heavy armored boots striking the floor plates in a perfect, uniform rhythm that felt entirely dictated by a machine's clock cycle. As the heavy lift transported them upward through the multi-layered subdecks of the 6-kilometer flagship, Arthur looked through the transparent observation glass, watching the inner workings of the Obsidian Armada unfold before his eyes. Thousands of automated maintenance drones moved along the structural conduits like iron ants, their movements perfectly calculated to minimize friction and maximize efficiency. There were no crew lounges, no common areas, and no signs of recreational comfort. Every square meter of the Dreadnought was dedicated entirely to tactical output, power distribution, and the immense cooling networks required to keep the ship's synchronized processors from burning out under operational loads. It was a premium sci-fi design pushed to its absolute logical extreme, a society that had completely traded its organic soul for the certainty of digital mathematics. The lift doors slid open with a soft, hydraulic hiss, revealing the expansive, multi-tiered command bridge of the Asterisk Zenith. The room was a masterpiece of clean, minimalist composition, filled with sharp holographic displays that projected scrolling data streams of the 700 dreadnoughts currently maintaining their planetary blockade outside the panoramic viewing viewport. In the center of the High Command dais stood High Admiral Valen, a senior commander whose cybernetically enhanced eyes flashed with the cold green light of the synchronized fleet network. He did not turn around immediately when Arthur entered, keeping his attention fixed on the countdown timer that was steadily ticking away the remaining hours of the Terran colony's independence. The automated tractor logs indicate that you have brought no weapons, no security escorts, and no official conditional surrender documents from your planetary government, Valen said, his voice modulated through an advanced translation matrix into a sharp, metallic hiss that carried an undercurrent of supreme condescension. He slowly turned his slender, armored torso to face the old human, his cybernetic gaze locking onto the wooden crate in Arthur's arms. Our Grand Council allocated this brief auditory window to process your species representative. Have you come to formalize the absolute submission of your infrastructure, or is your presence on this bridge merely a primitive administrative delay before we initiate the extraction sequence? Arthur walked calmly past the secondary console operators, ignoring the cold, unyielding stares of the enforcers who remained flanking the entrance. He approached a heavy, polished slate table situated in the exact center of the command dais, a surface usually reserved for projecting planetary invasion maps, and carefully set the wooden crate down on its smooth, dark surface. He flipped the brass latches with a slow, unhurried movement that cut cleanly through the high-frequency hum of the bridge's electronic systems. "I've come to discuss standard thermodynamics, Admiral," Arthur said softly, his voice a quiet, grounded baritone that remained entirely unbothered by the intimidating architecture or the grand display of military power. He carefully lifted the lid of the crate, revealing the unglazed Yixing clay teapot and the matching teacups nestled within the custom foam inserts. But it's a long journey from the outer rim, and my joints are a bit stiff from sitting in that cramped shuttle pilot's seat. If you don't mind, I'd like to prepare a quick pot of tea before we get down to the actual technical numbers. A proper analysis always goes smoother when the parameters are allowed to settle. High Admiral Valen's mandibles tightened in a display of sudden, sharp irritation, his enhanced eyes tracking the old engineer's calloused hands as Arthur lifted a small, insulated vacuum flask from the box. The enforcers around the perimeter raised their energy pikes slightly, waiting for a single, definitive command to drag the eccentric diplomat down to the brig for disrupting the dignity of the command deck. But Valen raised an armored hand, stopping them mid-stride. The hegemony prided itself on its absolute psychological dominance over lesser species, and to remove the human by force would imply that his strange, non-compliant behavior had somehow managed to disturb the rigid control of the Valari High Command. We will allow this brief, inefficient display of primitive cultural ritual to conclude before your final processing begins, Valen said coldly, stepping forward until he stood on the opposite side of the slate table, his posture completely rigid. But let us ensure the local environment is properly balanced for your comfort, Terran. Console operator. Increase the localized gravity matrix on the central dais by exactly 20%, and reduce the atmospheric temperature by 15 degrees. Let us see how your biological systems handle the cold reality of our dominion while you prepare your beverage. The environmental stabilizers responded instantly, the air on the bridge growing bitter and frigid within seconds as the moisture in the air formed faint, crystalline ice patterns along the metallic edges of the slate table. The increased gravity field slammed down on Arthur's shoulders like a physical weight, forcing the Vildari merchant staff hiding near the rear access doors to buckle at the knees, their bodies trembling under the sudden environmental shift. Arthur, however, did not flinch, and his steady, calloused hands did not shake as he opened the small tin of loose-leaf black tea leaves. His 40 years working inside the deep geothermal fabrication bays of the frontier had exposed him to extreme atmospheric pressures and volatile thermal hazards that made a controlled bridge simulation look like standard operational baseline. He calmly measured out a precise handful of the dried leaves, dropping them into the bottom of the dark clay pot with absolute, unhurried patience. The biting chill of the bridge's altered atmosphere caused thin plumes of frosty condensation to rise from Arthur's lips as he unscrewed the heavy cap of his insulated vacuum flask. The localized gravity matrix hummed like a low, vibrating bass note through the floor plates, pressing down on his old frame with an artificial density that would have forced a less experienced colonial worker to collapse to his knees. Arthur simply adjusted his stance, distributing his body weight evenly across his heels, completely unbothered by the environmental intimidation tactic. He tipped the flask forward, pouring the boiling water over the loose-leaf black tea in a slow, unbroken stream, the liquid splashing into the dark clay container with a rich, rhythmic gurgle. Instantly, the deep, earthy aroma of traditional Terran black tea blossomed into the space, cutting sharply through the sterile, chemically purified air of the high command deck. You see, Admiral, the interesting thing about this specific clay is its unique structural composition, Arthur said conversationally, his quiet baritone carrying clearly across the quiet bridge despite the high-frequency whine of the gravity projectors. He carefully placed the dark lid onto the teapot, sealing the steam inside so the dried leaves could begin their gradual infusion process. It's completely unglazed Yixing clay, harvested from the old riverbeds of Earth. Under a microscope, you'd see it's incredibly microporous. When the boiling water hits the interior walls, the intense heat causes the tiny, microscopic air pockets trapped within the clay matrix to expand slowly and evenly. It doesn't crack, it doesn't warp, and it doesn't fight the thermal energy. It simply breathes with the change in temperature. High Admiral Valen stepped closer to the slate table, his cybernetic eyes whirring quietly as they adjusted their focus, scanning the small, unassuming pottery with a mixture of growing impatience and cold curiosity. The data streams scrolling across his vision categorized the object as a low-tech earthenware vessel with a thermal baseline of exactly 95 degrees Celsius, calculating zero tactical relevance to the massive deployment outside the viewport. Your primitive pottery and your detailed explanations of mud baking are entirely irrelevant to the current tactical calculus, Terran, Balin said, his translated voice cutting through the fragrant steam with a sharp, mechanical snap. Outside this viewing glass, 700 super-heavy dreadnoughts are currently generating millions of terawatts of synchronized energy. Our primary cooling towers are constructed from a flawless, non-porous hyperalloy that reflects heat entirely away from our core systems. We do not need to breathe with the environment. We dominate it through absolute material rigidity. Arthur lifted the small clay teapot with an unhurried, steady grace, tilting it over the first tiny teacup to pour a thin, dark stream of steaming liquid into the container. The clean, minimalist composition of the bridge framed the simple action perfectly against the backdrop of the massive, jagged silhouettes of the Obsidian Armada hanging motionless in the black void outside. That's exactly what caught my attention when I was reviewing your public fleet registry data back on the station, Admiral. Arthur murmured softly, blowing gently across the surface of his cup to cool the dark brew before taking a slow, appreciative sip. Your engineers built everything around the concept of absolute reflection and absolute containment. You don't let the thermal energy out naturally through the material itself. You trap it behind rigid, unyielding walls, assuming that if the walls are thick enough, the physics of expansion can be ignored indefinitely. It is not an assumption. It is a mathematical certainty verified by 3 centuries of unblemished campaign logs, Balin countered, his slender, silver-armored arms crossing over his chest as he glared down at the old engineer. The synchronization network links every single reactor core in the fleet to the central processing core of the Zenith. If a single division experiences a localized thermal spike, the quantum arrays instantly redistribute the load across the remaining 699 vessels within a microsecond. The hyper-alloy cooling towers running along the spine of our ships are completely impervious to external structural degradation. Your primitive understanding of planetary thermodynamics cannot identify a single variance that our digital architecture has not already isolated and completely neutralized. Arthur set his tiny clay teacup back down onto the polished slate surface with a soft, distinct click that sounded surprisingly loud in the immense, silent room. He didn't offer a rebuttal, nor did he display any defensive agitation at the Admiral's dismissive tone. Instead, he slowly reached into his suit pocket and pulled out a small, high-detail structural data slate, laying it flat on the table right beside his tea set. The device activated immediately, projecting a clean, minimalist holographic blueprint of a Valari Dreadnought's external spine, specifically highlighting the massive, rigid cooling towers and their microscopic radiation fins. Your quantum processing core is an absolute marvel at calculating internal engineering variance, Admiral. I'll give your design teams that, Arthur said, his voice dropping into that steady, clinical tone he used when analyzing a failing geothermal core in the deep mining sectors of the rim. But a computer core only knows what its sensors are programmed to look for, and it doesn't understand outer rim agricultural logistics or local planetary conditions. For the past 3 weeks, our Terran agricultural development stations on the colonial world below have been processing a highly specific, microparticulate silicone dust. It's a standard, heavy byproduct of our deep soil terraforming filters, and we've been venting millions of metric tons of it directly into the local orbital sector through our atmospheric exhaust chimneys. Balin's cybernetic eyes widened slightly, the green light shifting to an unstable amber as his internal processors began to rapidly scan the physical data displayed on the human slate. The long-range navigation arrays identified that particulate cloud 48 hours ago, the Admiral stated, his posture stiffening as he turned his head slightly toward his primary console operators. The centralized quantum core categorized the dust as standard, harmless cosmic debris. It possesses zero kinetic mass, no active energy signatures, and zero chemical toxicity. It is completely incapable of penetrating our primary shielding or damaging our hull plating. It ignored it because it isn't a weapon, Admiral, Arthur explained calmly, lifting his teapot once again to refill his small clay cup with the steaming, dark tea. The silicone dust didn't try to break through your shields. It simply floated through them like mist. Over the last 48 hours, as your 700 dreadnoughts maintained their tight, synchronized orbital blockade grid, those microparticles have been slowly, continuously settling into the microscopic cooling vent microgrooves of your rigid, non-porous hyperalloy cooling towers. At your current baseline idling temperature, the dust is completely inert. It's just sitting there, completely invisible to your tactical sensors because it isn't doing any damage. The bridge fell into a sudden, absolute silence, the only sound being the low, rhythmic hum of the ship's primary power generators. Valen turned sharply toward his chief console operator, his previous mechanical comm cracking for the first time since Arthur had boarded the vessel. Run an immediate, high-resolution diagnostic scan on the primary intake manifolds of the spine cooling towers across the entire 1st and 2nd Fleet divisions, Valen commanded, his voice losing its translated hiss and dropping into a tense, urgent rasp. Identify any foreign particulate accumulation within the radiation fins immediately, and cross-reference the data with the human structural profile. Arthur took another slow, unhurried sip of his black tea, letting the warmth of the clay cup soothe his weathered fingers against the artificial chill of the room. The diagnostic scan is going to tell you exactly what my unglazed teacup just demonstrated to me, Admiral, Arthur said softly, his steady gaze meeting the flashing green eyes of the High Commander. The moment your fleet synchronizes its primary plasma lances to fire on our colony, the extreme thermal output will cause your hyperalloy cooling towers to expand rapidly under the sudden heat load. But because your alloy is perfectly rigid and cannot flex, the intense heat will instantly vitrify that trapped silicone dust, turning it into a solid, non-porous glass glaze across your entire radiation grid. You won't be able to radiate a single watt of energy into the vacuum. The chief console operator froze, his slender fingers trembling over the holographic interfaces as the diagnostic results began to flood the main displays in brilliant, flashing columns of emergency red data. Admiral, the human's calculation is completely accurate, the operator stammered, his face turning pale under his dark visor. The particulate density within the external radiation fins across all 700 vessels is currently at 98% capacity. If we attempt to discharge the primary weapon arrays, the sudden thermal expansion will cause the rigid cooling towers to instantly fracture under their own internal structural stress. The entire synchronization network will experience a catastrophic thermal feedback loop within 4 seconds, melting the reactor cores before the first plasma lance can even clear the barrel. Arthur held up his small clay teacup, letting the harsh, cinematic lighting of the bridge catch the soft, organic texture of the Yixing clay. You built a mathematically perfect fleet, Admiral, but you forgot that nature always demands an escape valve for energy, Arthur murmured, his voice echoing clearly through the stunned, silent command center. If you try to fire on our people, your own mechanical perfection will tear your ships apart from the inside out. You see, sometimes a little bit of porous flexibility is worth more than a universe of rigid steel. High Admiral Valen took a slow, heavy step back from the polished slate table, his slender, silver-armored hands dropping to his sides as his cybernetic vision filled with a cascading wall of emergency red data streams. Across all 700 divisions of the Obsidian Armada, the automated warning systems were finally waking up to the thermal trap, their localized processors flashing identical alerts that confirmed the old human's engineering assessment. The absolute mathematical certainty of their grand victory had vanished in an instant, replaced by a glaring, unyielding thermodynamic equation that could not be bypassed by quantum processing, military discipline, or political willpower. The grand vanguard of the Valari Hegemony was entirely paralyzed, frozen in orbit not by a massive weapon system or a grand armada of human warships, but by an old engineer with a small pot of loose-leaf black tea. This is An absolute violation of standard engagement protocols, Balin whispered, his voice stripped of its previous mechanical arrogance as he stared at the flashing red data monitors. He turned his head slowly back toward Arthur, his cybernetic lenses whirring frantically as they tried to recategorize the old man standing before him. You have systematically disabled the primary offensive capability of a sovereign galactic fleet without a single weapon discharge, without a kinetic threat, and without violating our perimeter sensors. Who authorized this deployment? What branch of the Terran military architecture conceived this specific particulate infiltration? Arthur didn't answer right away, choosing instead to lift his small clay teapot and pour a fresh stream of steaming liquid into his tiny cup. The rich, earthy aroma of the tea continued to rise into the cold air of the bridge, a gentle, completely organic counterpoint to the sterile smell of overstressed circuitry and cooling ozone that was beginning to waft from the consoles. No one authorized a deployment, Admiral, because as I told you before, this isn't a military operation, Arthur said softly, his voice remaining a steady, unhurried baritone that anchored the quiet room. The Terran military didn't even know your cooling towers were rigid until I looked at the public blueprints. Our planetary government didn't vent that silicone dust to stop your fleet. They vented it because we're trying to grow wheat on a world that has too much silica in the soil. It was a standard industrial waste cycle. You expect me to believe that the neutralization of the Obsidian Armada was an industrial accident? Balin hissed, his mandibles flaring in a mixture of defensive anger and deep structural confusion. He stepped back toward the slate table, slamming his armored fist against the dark surface, though the vibration did not cause Arthur's steady hand to flinch. The mathematical probability of a civilian waste cycle perfectly matching the exact vitrification temperature of our hyperalloy cooling systems is astronomical. Your species has practiced a deliberate deception, mapping our vulnerabilities long before our ships ever transitioned into this sector. The probability isn't astronomical, Admiral, it's just inevitable, Arthur replied, taking a slow, measured sip of his hot tea before setting the cup back down with a soft click. When you build 700 identical ships from the exact same continuous alloy mold, using the exact same non-porous design, you don't create an invincible fleet. You just create an identical set of 700 thermal targets. Every single material in this universe has a breaking point where the physics of heat expansion can't be cheated by a software update. Your quantum core ignored the dust because your programmers defined safety as the absence of a kinetic missile. They forgot that the most dangerous thing in the galaxy isn't a bomb. It's a tight seal that doesn't know how to let the pressure out. The primary console operator turned away from his flashing interface, his voice trembling with an urgent, high-pitched panic that completely stripped him of his previous military dignity. Admiral, the localized thermal sensors on the asterisk zenith spine are indicating a steady rise in baseline retention heat. Because the silicone particulate is blocking the microscopic exhaust vents, the ambient warmth generated by our synchronized processing network has nowhere to go. If we maintain our current tight orbital grid for another 30 minutes, the internal hull temperature will exceed safe operational parameters across the entire division, even if we never fire a single shot. Balin's posture stiffened, his cybernetic eyes flashing an unstable, erratic green as he processed the operator's warning. The trap was closing tighter, driven not by human malice, but by the relentless, unyielding laws of thermodynamics. The very system that made the Obsidian Armada unstoppable, their perfect, synchronized, high-energy processing network, was now acting as a slow-burning furnace that would cook the ships from the inside out if they remained stationary. The absolute rigidity that the Valari engineers had prized as their greatest strength had become their ultimate executioner. We can vent the liquid coolant manually, Balin suggested, his voice dropping into a desperate, calculating rasp as he leaned over the console. We can flush the primary spine arrays with raw synthetic lipids, forcing the particulate matter out through the secondary emergency pressure valves before the vitrification temperature is reached. Force the purge across all divisions immediately. You can try that, Admiral, but I wouldn't recommend it if you want to keep your reactors intact, Arthur said, his voice dropping into that calm, clinical tone he used when guiding young engineering apprentices through a volatile colonial core breach. The moment you open those secondary emergency valves, the sudden drop in internal pressure will trigger a cavitation event within your synthetic liquid coolant. Because your hyper-alloy cooling towers are rigid and cannot flex to absorb the pressure wave, those tiny vapor bubbles will collapse with enough localized force to punch thousands of microscopic holes through your internal plumbing. You'll flush the dust, sure, but you'll also bleed your entire coolant reserve directly into the vacuum of space, leaving your reactor cores completely dry within 10 seconds. The console operator's fingers froze over the holographic controls, his head dropping as he ran a quick digital simulation of the Admiral's proposed purge sequence. The human's analysis is mathematically sound, Admiral, the operator whispered, his voice hollow with absolute defeat. The cavitation simulation predicts a 94% structural failure rate across the primary cooling conduits within the first 3 seconds of a manual pressure flush. A manual purge will result in immediate, catastrophic core meltdowns across the entire division. We have no operational protocol to clear the radiation fins without destroying the infrastructure of the ships. High Admiral Valen turned slowly back toward the center of the command dais, his armored shoulders slumping slightly under the weight of the environmental gravity field that he had increased to intimidate the old man. He looked at the simple wooden crate, the dark clay teapot, and the old Terran engineer who was calmly pouring the last remaining drops of hot water from his thermal flask into the unglazed pottery. There was no grand display of human triumph on Arthur's face, no smug arrogance, and no weapon in his hands. There was only the quiet, patient baseline of a master craftsman who understood that the universe always wins against anyone who tries to build an unbreakable wall. You did not come here to negotiate a surrender, Arthur Pendelton, Valen said quietly, his voice finally dropping the artificial, metallic hiss of his translation matrix, revealing a tired, organic tone that sounded remarkably ancient. You came here to show me that our entire empire is built on a design flaw. You came to show me that our 3 centuries of conquest were merely a sequence of fortunate parameters that have finally run out of runway. What are the terms of the Terran Federation to allow my ships to leave this sector with their reactors intact? Arthur lifted his small clay teacup, holding it up between his fingers so the soft, amber light of the primary console caught the raw, porous texture of the baked earth. The Terran Federation doesn't have terms for you, Admiral, because we aren't your conquerors, Arthur said softly, his steady gaze meeting the dimmed, whirring lenses of the High Commander. We're just a group of farmers and engineers who want to cultivate our fields and keep our families warm on the frontier. We don't want your territory, we don't want your technology, and we don't want your submission. We just want you to take your ships out of our sky so our crops can get the sunlight they need to grow. And the particulate glaze? Valen asked, his cybernetic eyes focusing on the blueprint display that was still glowing red on the table. How do we clear our radiation fins if a manual purge will destroy our conduits? My fleet cannot navigate the long-range hyperspace lanes if our baseline thermal dissipation remains choked by your planetary dust. That's the beautiful thing about thermodynamics, Admiral. Everything cools down if you give it enough time and distance, Arthur explained with a gentle, reassuring nod as he took his final sip of black tea. If you disengage your synchronization network, power down your primary plasma targeting arrays, and use your low-output auxiliary thrusters to drift slowly backward out of our orbital sector, the decrease in baseline energy generation will allow your hyper-alloy towers to settle. Once you're out in deep space away from our terraforming dust cloud, the natural temperature drop will cause the alloy to contract slightly. The silicone particles will lose their grip on the metal, and the natural solar wind will sweep them away into the void within 3 days. You don't need a weapon to fix this system, you just need to let the machine rest. High Admiral Valen stood in absolute silence, his chest plates rising and falling in a slow, heavy rhythm as his internal systems processed the finality of the engineering data. The command bridge of the Asterisk Zenith, once an arena of absolute digital authority, now felt remarkably small, cold, and heavy under the weight of its own paralyzed technology. The scrolling green data streams that usually signified absolute tactical readiness had been completely replaced by amber caution parameters, warning the crew that the flagship's baseline temperature was continuing its slow, inexorable climb toward a critical threshold. Every second they spent maintaining their rigid geometric formation over the Terran colony brought them closer to a self-inflicted structural disaster that no quantum processor could prevent. De-escalate the localized environmental modifiers immediately, Balin commanded, his voice devoid of its previous mechanical edge as he signaled the primary console operator. Return the gravity matrix on the central dais to standard baseline parameters, and normalize the bridge temperature. The simulation has reached its conclusion. The heavy, oppressive weight that had been pressing down on Arthur's shoulders lifted instantly with a faint, electronic hum, and the bitter, icy chill in the air began to recede as the ship's climate control systems cycled back to their standard, non-hostile settings. Arthur didn't acknowledge the change with a sigh of relief or a shift in his posture. He simply continued to wipe down the edge of his unglazed clay teapot with a small, clean cloth he had pulled from his wooden crate. His hands remained as steady and calm as they had been during the height of the environmental intimidation, his focus entirely dedicated to the care of his traditional craftsmanship. The synchronization network is beginning to report minor thermal fluctuations in the 3rd and 5th Dreadnought divisions, Admiral, the primary console operator reported, his voice hollow with exhaustion as he watched the red indicators creep higher across his interface. The automated maintenance drones are attempting to clear the external spine intakes manually, but the microparticulate silicone dust is too deeply embedded within the radiation fins. Their kinetic cleaning tools are entirely ineffective against the density of the accumulation. We are running out of operational margin. Balin stepped away from the primary viewing viewport, walking slowly back toward the polished slate table where Arthur was neatly nesting his small clay teacups back into their custom foam inserts. The High Admiral looked down at the simple wooden box, his cybernetic eyes whirring quietly as they recorded the pristine, low-tech materials that had completely dismantled the offensive strategy of a 3-century-old empire. It is a profound irony, Arthur Pendelton, Balin said softly, his translated voice carrying a tone of deep, reflective exhaustion. The hegemony spent generations refining our military architecture to survive the most advanced plasma batteries and electronic warfare suites the core worlds could deploy against us. We built our armor to be impenetrable, our code to be unhackable, and our synchronization to be absolute. Yet, we are forced to retreat because your people wanted to plant grain in silica-heavy dirt. The universe doesn't care about your military doctrines, Admiral, Arthur replied gently, placing the lid back onto his clay teapot and securing it with a careful, protective hand. Physics doesn't care about conquest, and thermodynamics doesn't take sides in a political expansion. When you build a system that relies on absolute perfection and absolute rigidity to survive, you aren't building a monument to strength. You're just building a giant glass house that's waiting for the right vibration to come along and shatter it. A truly resilient design doesn't try to master the environment. It leaves room to adjust when the parameters change unexpectedly. Our High Grand Council will not easily comprehend this report, Balin muttered, his slender, armored fingers tracing the edge of the data slate Arthur had left on the table. They are accustomed to analyzing casualty metrics, planetary yield percentages, and structural damage evaluations after a campaign. They will look at the logs of the Obsidian Armada and see 700 super-heavy capital ships retreating from an unarmored civilian shuttle without a single shot being fired. They will demand to know what weapon the humans deployed to force our compliance. Then you tell them that we deployed an old engineer with a teacup, Admiral, Arthur said, a faint, warm smile wrinkling the corners of his deeply lined eyes as he fastened the first brass latch on his wooden crate with a distinct, metallic snap. Tell them that the Terran Federation doesn't fight with weapons that destroy infrastructure. We fight with the basic laws of nature that keep the universe in balance. If your council tries to send another fleet down here with the exact same rigid engineering templates, They won't even make it past our orbital filters before their own reactors turn them into shooting stars. We don't need to build an army when the physics of heat expansion is already doing the job for us." The chief console operator raised his hand, his eyes scanning a new set of data streams that had just popped up on his primary display terminal. "Admiral, the centralized quantum core has completed the long-range navigational calculation based on the low-output drift parameters the human suggested. If we disengage the primary sub-light synchronization network now and allow the divisions to separate into independent orbital trajectories, the thermal retention metrics drop by 40% within the first 12 minutes. The reactors will stabilize long before the vitrification point is reached." Valen closed his cybernetic eyes for a brief, agonizing moment, the internal conflict within his command protocols finally settling into a cold, logical acceptance of reality. He knew that to remain in formation out of stubborn imperial pride would result in the complete, catastrophic destruction of the finest fleet the hegemony had ever constructed. To retreat was a humiliation, but to stay was absolute, irreversible engineering suicide. "Authorize the fleet-wide disengagement sequence immediately," Valen commanded, his voice ringing out across the silent bridge with an absolute, unyielding clarity. "Break the synchronization link between all divisions. Instruct all capital ships to power down their primary plasma lance targeting matrices and shift their main power distribution lines away from the quantum core. We will exit this sector utilizing low-output auxiliary thrusters, drifting backward until we clear the particulate cloud boundary. The synchronization link has been officially severed, Admiral," the operator responded, his fingers moving across the console with a rapid, frantic efficiency as the massive holographic grid display in the center of the room began to break apart into 700 independent, blinking icons. "The Dreadnoughts are reporting immediate thermal stabilization across all sectors. The internal hull temperatures are beginning to drop back toward baseline parameters. The feedback loop has been completely averted." Arthur picked up his wooden crate from the slate table, cradling it securely against his wool suit jacket with the ease of a man who had completed a standard maintenance shift at a local power plant. He looked toward the High Admiral, his posture relaxed and completely non-threatening, his demeanor entirely devoid of the triumphant arrogance that usually characterized a victorious diplomatic representative. "Thank you for the tea, Admiral," Arthur said with a polite, genuine nod of his head. "It's always a pleasure to meet a fellow commander who knows how to read a diagnostic readout before the system completely locks up on him. I'll take my shuttle back down to the colony now. I believe our governor has some farming reports he needs to finish before the harvest season starts." Valen watched the old human turn and walk toward the primary elevator shafts, the squad of silver-armored enforcers slowly stepping aside to open his path without waiting for a mechanical command from the dais. The rigid, synchronized cadence that had defined their movements when they brought Arthur onto the bridge was completely gone, replaced by a quiet, uncertain hesitation as they realized the old man carried the survival of their entire fleet within his wooden box. "Arthur Pendelton," Valen called out just as the lift doors began to slide open with a soft hiss. Arthur paused, resting his hand against the edge of the frame as he looked back over his shoulder. "Yes, Admiral? If the Terran Federation ever decides to export your unglazed clay pottery to the core systems," Valen said, his cybernetic eyes focusing on the wooden crate one final time with a look of profound, enduring respect, "make sure you include a copy of your industrial thermal manuals in the shipment. Our engineering academies may have a great deal of recalculating to do before our next deployment cycle." "I'll make sure to mention that to the export board, Admiral," Arthur replied with a soft, gentle chuckle. "But remember, the manuals won't do you any good if you don't keep your intakes clean. Have a safe drift back to the core." The heavy lift doors slid shut with a smooth, hydraulic click, sealing Arthur inside as the transport began its long descent back down toward the primary hangar bays. On the bridge of the Asterisk Zenith, High Admiral Valen turned back toward the panoramic viewing viewport, watching through the massive glass as the 700 super-heavy dreadnoughts of the Obsidian Armada slowly, methodically began to drift backward through the dark void, their mighty prows dipping in unison as they retreated from the tiny human colony below, leaving the sky clear for the morning sun to reach the fields. The descent through the spine of the monolithic flagship felt remarkably different from Arthur Pendelton's initial ascent. The primary lift car dropped smoothly through the structural layers of the 6-kilometer Dreadnought, but the mechanical atmosphere within the ship had undergone a profound, almost silent transformation. The frantic, high-frequency hum of the centralized quantum processing core had wound down into a low, idling purr, and the cold amber warning lights along the bulkheads were steadily turning back to a muted, stable blue. Through the transparent observation glass, Arthur watched thousands of automated maintenance drones halting their frantic scraping across the internal conduits, returning to their docking berths in an orderly, pre-programmed sequence. The immediate crisis had passed, neutralized completely by a shift in thermodynamic parameters. Arthur cradled the wooden crate against his wool suit jacket, his fingers resting lightly over the brass latches to ensure his traditional clay tea set remained undisturbed by the subtle vibration of the braking thrusters. When the lift doors slid open with a soft, hydraulic hiss, he stepped back out into the expansive, sterile environment of the primary hangar bay. The squad of silver-armored Valari enforcers who had escorted him up to the command dais were no longer flanking him in a rigid, intimidating perimeter. Instead, they stood at a respectful distance near the hangar gates, their energy pikes held low and passive against their armored legs. They did not move to obstruct him, nor did they look at him with the cold condescension of an advanced species processing a primitive administrative error. They looked at him like soldiers who had just watched a master engineer defuse a bomb with his bare hands. As Arthur walked calmly across the high-gloss metallic floor plates toward his unarmored civilian shuttle, a sleek, silver diplomatic skiff hissed to a halt on the adjacent landing grid. The cockpit canopy slid back to reveal the trembling, pale form of the Valari merchant attaché, his sensory antennae twitching wildly in a frantic state of bureaucratic panic as he scrambled out onto the deck plates, his robes dragging through the clean floor. He had been hiding in the logistics subdeck for the last 2 hours, fully expecting the entire sector to explode into a blinding flash of plasma fire and melting hyperalloy. Arthur, by the ancestral architects, you are still biologically integrated. The merchant gasped, rushing over to the old engineer while casting terrified glances up at the towering vaulted ceiling of the hangar bay. The local network sensors just reported a total, fleet-wide synchronization collapse across all 700 capital ships. The primary targeting arrays dropped to zero output, and the Dreadnoughts are actively drifting backward away from our colony's upper atmosphere. What did you do to them inside that high command center? Did the Terran Federation secretly deploy a localized logic virus through your data slate? We didn't deploy anything of the sort, my friend, Arthur said, his voice a quiet, unhurried baritone that anchored the frantic energy of the hangar bay. He stopped beside the primary airlock of his civilian transport, carefully setting the wooden crate down on a small utility workbench to inspect the seals one final time before departure. A logic virus would have just given their quantum processing core a new equation to solve, and their programmers would have found a way to patch it within a few deployment cycles. You can't beat a machine like the Obsidian Armada by trying to outthink its software. You have to remind it that it still has to live inside the physical world, and the physical world doesn't care about your digital perfection. But they are retreating, the merchant whispered loudly, his antennae curling tightly as he pointed a trembling finger toward the massive atmospheric containment field where the open void was visible. The Valari Hegemony has never abandoned a resource extraction sequence in 3 centuries of recorded sector expansion. If the Grand Council discovers that their entire vanguard was paralyzed by an unarmored civilian shuttle with zero kinetic threat potential, they will completely destabilize our trade routes out of sheer administrative embarrassment. They must provide an explanation to the Galactic Assembly. Then they can tell the Assembly that they ran into a basic supply line failure, because that's exactly what it was, Arthur replied gently, lifting the dark lid of his wooden box to ensure the micro-porous Yixing clay teapot had settled completely into its protective foam insert without any hairline fractures. The Valari engineers thought they could maximize their fleet's defensive efficiency by creating an absolutely rigid, non-porous hyper-alloy hull that reflected heat entirely away from their systems. It's a beautiful design on paper, but it operates on a zero-tolerance budget for environmental variance. The moment you introduce a localized factor that their sensors weren't programmed to look for, like our terraforming silicone dust, the whole system chokes on its own baseline energy because it has no way to breathe. It is an engineering methodology that defies all established galactic military doctrines. A sharp, translated voice echoed from the hangar access corridor. Arthur turned his head slowly to see High Admiral Valen walking out onto the deck plates, his slender, silver-armored frame completely unescorted, his cybernetic eyes whirring quietly as they locked onto the old human engineer. He had left the command bridge to personally witness the departure of the unique diplomat who had completely rewritten their tactical algorithms without drawing a single tool from his belt. Arthur didn't raise his hands or shift into a defensive posture. He simply leaned back against the hull of his shuttle, keeping his expression completely relaxed. "Physics doesn't care about your military doctrines, Admiral," Arthur said softly, his steady gaze meeting the dimmed green light of the High Commander's optical lenses. "A doctrine is just a set of rules that human beings or Valari counselors make up to make themselves feel like they're in control of a chaotic universe. But thermodynamics doesn't take bribes, and it doesn't read your campaign logs. If you trap millions of terawatts of thermal energy behind a rigid wall without providing a natural, flexible escape valve, the heat will always find a way to tear your wall down from the inside out. Your fleet wasn't defeated by our people. It was defeated by its own absolute rigidity." Valen stopped exactly 10 feet away from the utility workbench, his arms folded behind his back in a posture that was remarkably devoid of his previous imperial arrogance. "Our structural engineering academies will require decades to fully map the systemic vulnerabilities your analysis has exposed within our current ship templates," the Admiral stated, his metallic voice carrying a tone of deep, clinical respect that resonated through the quiet hangar bay. "The High Grand Council has already issued an immediate, emergency administrative hold on all secondary expansion sequences within this sector until our spine radiation fins can be completely retrofitted with porous, flexible microalloy matrices that mimic the thermal properties of your traditional Terran earthenware." "That's a very sensible engineering decision, Admiral," Arthur said with a warm, genuine smile that wrinkled the corners of his deeply lined face. He reached down to close the lid of his wooden box, fastening the brass latches with a definitive, satisfying snap. "A machine that knows how to bend with the wind will always outlast a machine that tries to break it. If your design teams ever need a few consultation notes on localized heat dissipation or fluid dynamics under high-gravity parameters, our colonial engineering boards on the world below would be more than happy to share our datasheets with you. We're always willing to help a neighbor fix his plumbing, provided he keeps his weapons pointed away from our fields. Your offer will be formally logged into our diplomatic registry, Arthur Pendelton," Valen replied, his head bowing in a slow, deliberate gesture of profound professional recognition that caused the surrounding enforcers to stiffen in surprise. "The hegemony recognizes individuals who master their environment through absolute clarity of processing. You entered our flagship as a primitive captive of our countdown timer, but you leave it as the only entity in this sector who understands the true baseline of our infrastructure. May your agricultural filters continue to function within safe operational metrics. Thank you, Admiral, and may your cooling towers always find a way to breathe," Arthur said, lifting the wooden crate carefully into his arms and stepping through the primary airlock of his civilian transport. The cabin doors slid shut behind him with a smooth, airtight hiss, sealing him away from the high-contrast lights and brutalist architecture of the Valari Dreadnought. Within minutes, the automated launch protocols of the Asterisk Zenith engaged, releasing the small white shuttle from the tractor grid and allowing it to drift smoothly out through the atmospheric containment field into the great, open dark of the outer rim. From the pilot's seat of his transport, Arthur looked out through the panoramic viewport, watching the grand silhouette of the Obsidian Armada continue its slow, methodical retreat. The 700 super heavy capital ships were no longer maintaining their suffocating, geometric grid formation over the human colony. They were separating into independent, low-output drift vectors, their massive hulls glowing with a faint, cooling blue light as the natural vacuum of deep space swept the vitrified silicone dust away from their radiation fins. The sky above the Terran frontier world was finally opening up, the dark shards of volcanic glass pulling back into the shadows of the solar system, leaving the upper atmosphere completely clear for the morning sun to reach the vast, sprawling grain fields below. Arthur settled back into his flight harness, a soft, tired sigh escaping his lips as he set the small wooden box securely into the passenger seat beside him. He reached down to toggle the short-range communications array, connecting back to the primary briefing room of the colonial station where the governor and the defensive staff were still staring at their tracking monitors in absolute, unmitigated disbelief. "Governor, this is Arthur," the old engineer said into the microphone, his voice a calm, unhurried baritone that carried the steady, unyielding patience of the frontier. "The parameters have settled, and the system has successfully returned to its baseline equilibrium. The Armada is stepping back to clean their intakes, and they won't be bothering our sector anymore. Go ahead and tell the agricultural teams to clear the heavy machinery for the morning shift. We have a lot of wheat to harvest before the winter frost sets in, and we've wasted enough good sunlight for one day."